yeah, I wanted to thank everybody for, reading the book and taking the time out to read the book and show up and talk about it. And, you know, when you write a book, you write it in hopes that people are going to read it. So that makes me, really happy. And before I start talking about the book, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the situation that we're in right now. Um, we're in a period of political struggle that's more politically advanced than in 2014 and 2015, which was when the book was written. It was published in 2016, but it was written in 2015, right? Takes a little while to do those kinds of things. um, and this moment is advanced in a number of ways. And it's advanced in the sense that there are far more self-identified Marxists and more discussion and debate about Marxist theory in the streets than there was in 2014, 2015. It is advanced in terms of street fighting. It is advanced in the sense of more labor action and the normalization of wildcat strikes in the US that uh, came out of Red for Ed. And it's more advanced in the struggle against fascism and the far right. Um, but the far right and the police state has also advanced, right? So now we're in this incredibly weird moment of capitalism where interpersonal interactions with the right are an immediate threat. In Austin, about a week and a half ago, we had a car plow in and kill a comrade who was in the streets, who identified as a libertarian. And for me to, organize for a libertarian, it just really shows us like strange times that we're living in. And not that this person was, I mean, he was new to his political development, and now he's been killed by the right. So the right is very much a threat to us right now in ways that it wasn't, an immediate threat in ways that it wasn't in 2014, 2015. And now, of course, we have people refusing to mask, the absurdity of that. And so the extra economic threats that we're facing are exacerbated and bound up with the immediate economic violence of capitalism, and particularly in American capitalism under COVID. So we have, in addition to the violence that isn't immediately economic in the transactional sense, police powers, militias, fascists, 4chan trolls, for example. We're also dealing with economic forces like mass unemployment, eviction, hunger, just massive assaults on the working class. And those of us who are, who still have jobs feel more stuck in them than ever. So I'm saying all of this. I feel like as socialists, we kind of give these overviews when we talk about things, but I want to talk about this at first because I want to emphasize the relative difference of the moment that we're in from when I was writing the book. But I'd like to also I'm bringing it up in an interpersonal sense as well. I want to acknowledge that I know that most of you are struggling, as is the entirety of the class, as am I. And I don't want to just theoretically talk above the situation or ignore the situation or start yapping about theory in a way that's disengaged from the reality of the moment or the reality of, you, the folks that I'm speaking to right now. It's hard in these webinar things or these, Zoom discussions, because when you're in person, you can read the room, but we can't really do that anymore. We can't really set a tone in a room anymore. So the first thing that I wanted to do was acknowledge that I know that you're here and I want to thank you for being here. And I know that this is a difficult time period. And so I think that it makes it extra important for us to come together and understand the interpersonal as much as the overarching theoretical questions. And talking about questions, so I'm going to jump into the questions that you've given me, and they've been such good questions and such generous questions that I think that I'm going to take up most of the time answering them. I am going to take them a bit out of order, though. So the first question that I'm going to answer that you sent in was, What was your inspiration to write the book? Was it based on specific experiences in organizing, whether successes or failures or both, or more from an intellectual drive to fill gaps in the body of theory, or both? Okay, so, of course, it was definitely both. I'm not saying that because that's the easy answer to the question, but because problems of theory and practice are interrelated, and they're always interrelated, and they're mutually constituting. And to put it in Marxist language, they're dialectic. They're dialectical. They operate in a dialectic way. And I think that at the time when I was writing the book, there was a real political compartmentalization against between struggles against oppression on the one hand and workplace action on the other, or even, socialist revolution more broadly construed. And I found that most of the Marxist approaches, including the one that I found myself falling into, were either hackish and extremely class reductionist, or completely moralistic, or usually both. And there was a suspicious lack of Marx in the Marxist responses. And, I guess I'll give you an example that some of you might be familiar with. Some of the hackish responses were, like, well, identity-based oppression arises from capitalism, so it'll all be sorted out when we get rid of capitalism. So we just need to focus on getting rid of capitalism right now. And the moralistic response on the other side of the equation is, okay, your oppression might only be tangentially tied to capitalism or some weird phenomenon arising from capitalism that none of us really understand, or it might even be unrelated to capitalism and capitalism's getting in the way of solving it. But I disagree with those class reductionists, and I don't have any clue about what you're going through and how it relates, but I'm here for you. I stand with you because you are oppressed, and I want to be a part of the tribune of the oppressed, and So the problem with both of these attitudes is that they externalize oppression as something that's separable from material social relations. And that's what I mean by class, the position of people within the development of forces within material social relations. So what's the solution to this double wrongheadedness, if you will? And I think that the class reductionist position, the so-called class reductionist position, is wrong on two counts. It's wrong about how oppression maintains the overarching general situation of capitalist exploitation. And class reductionists often complain about identity politics, but class reductionism actually reduces class itself to an identity often. It's basically saying that class is the right identity to focus on and organize around, and all of the other identities take away from this one really important identity. And it, when it gets really bad, it leads to a fetishization, and it turns class into this caricature of a certain persona. In the book, I call it mallet man. Others might call it, the white working class, maybe embodied by the male, 19th century industrial worker. But often this is thought of as like the normal worker, the standard worker, the heterosexual cisgendered Y and his guy and his wife, and they're the universal proletarian. And then, then there's other people that are also working class, but they have all these other problems, right? And so this kind of universalism is a reactionary universalism. And we're obviously seeing the political mistakes now that this kind of conservative politics leads to. And I think that the mistake of the position is, on one hand, it's an emotional mistake. It's callous towards the joy and the suffering and the history of other workers. And it marginalizes that reality and that reaction to the realities of class, and it feels threatened by it. And it feels, outside of it, right? Oh my God, there's workers that I don't immediately relate to. What are we gonna do? Am I being excluded now? So there's this kind of emotional mistake that I think happens. And On the other hand, you have that other problem of the, the moral response of, I don't know how this relates to socialist revolution, but I stand with you. And I think that that's a pretty decent first emotional response. And I saw a lot of this with trans issues back in the 2010s. You'd have socialists saying, man, I don't have any fucking idea what this has to do with capitalism, but I'm all against oppression and I recognize that trans people are oppressed, so I stand with you. And I mean, this is, like I said, this is a good first response when you don't understand something. And what's wrong with it is that it's simply basic human decency. It has no explanatory power. So it's a good first instinct for a Marxist. We want to have basic human decency, but we eventually need to have to try to understand a situation through material social relations, or else what we're doing is just liberal politeness. And that liberal politeness dismisses the gravity and the fullness of both people's oppressions and their resilience and what that resilience means to them. So it actually becomes a barrier for understanding how to stand up for other people in the class, how to build solidarity with people in the class, how to listen to people in the class, the whole 9 yards. So, I knew on a gut level that we needed to go beyond this, because the base of Marxist economics is that economics is not just some kind of, external aspect of social life, but that everything emerging from a society is shaped by, if not invented by or created by, its material social relations. And that means that there isn't just class and other identities. That means that the way that social reality is formed is through these material social relations. So living within the capitalist mode of production, our communal and our personal lives are forged through the crucible of capitalist social relations. And because it is our collective totality. And so we can look at everything through a Marxist lens. So I set out to look at queer existence through a Marxist lens in the book. And curiously, that meant turning away from, not entirely, but maybe backing up from Engels's rather interesting but rudimentary analysis of gender, which was kind of put forward in the 20th century as sort of the end all and be all, and turning towards readings of Marx and kind of in-depth analyses of Marx's work and capital in particular. So I'm thinking in terms of Heather Brown's work, Lisa Vogel's work, and then the work that came out of that, the social reproduction theory. So I think that the most straightforward argument of the book is me saying in 2014 or 2015, hey, let's stop talking about queer consumerism and bad gays not being radical enough and all that, and start looking at how the reproduction of capital requires specific gender the reproduction of capital requires specific gender development. It requires gender to exist in a particular way. And then queer oppression is intimately related to that particular mandate. So how do we understand that? That becomes the central point of the book, And so to get back to this question, I would argue that there is nothing that can be too theoretical to be of practical relevance. I think that what happens sometimes is that important concepts are talked about in a way that alienates people. It makes them feel like crap. It makes them feel like they're not an insider. It makes them feel like they haven't read enough. It makes them feel like they can't participate in the conversation. So it gets dismissed as like, oh, it's just a bunch of theoretical bullshit. And then, you people, we're in the streets doing important things, and, we don't need all that theory or whatever. But it's simply because the communication isn't, that people are talking over people and not talking with them and thinking with them actively in the streets. And as many of us are now, I guess in our online worlds with one another. So that is the first question that was asked me. And the second question was this, let me see. You're explicit about addressing different audiences, specifically people coming to the table from Marxism from feminism and from queer theory. Can you share some responses to the book from those audiences, whether representative or remarkable? So this is a really fun thing to talk about for me. So I was surprised that it had a positive reception among non-Marxist queer readers. And that was actually kind of the first feedback that I got, which I was surprised by. I thought that it was going to be Marxist people learning about queer stuff first, not queer people learning about Marxist stuff first. And I felt like that was maybe a little bit, for my history in organizing, that felt like a little bit more of a leap, particularly in this time period in the 2010s. So I was excited about that. And what that told me is that the frameworks that were being put forward by queer politics, like homonormativity, for example, was a weak, everybody kind of knew it was a weak framework for understanding a larger queer politics, and people were looking for something else. The politics at the time were so stagnant that even in Marxist circles, the predominant way queerness was being linked to economics was through the language of consumerism, like bad gays being too normie and materialistic and shallow. And that's like a really self-hating and reactionary way to look at queer politics. So I think that a lot of people were really happy to find an articulation of a queer politics that wasn't, oh, there's a good way of being gay and a bad way of being gay. And instead, it was like, look, if you live in a big house in the suburbs and you're a landlord, you're probably a gay person that acts like a member of the ruling class because you're a member of the ruling class. And if you're a working class person who's oppressed in terms of sexuality or gender, you don't really need to position yourself as aesthetically edgy in some way. And if you are aesthetically edgy in some way, you're also good. You know, you don't need to be ashamed of wearing lipstick, or you're not less revolutionary because you like wearing glitter platform shoes. And so these were actually some of the weird debates that I heard amongst socialists when we started talking about gender. You know, is wearing lipstick right or wrong? It's like, whoa, 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 you know, anyway. But it made me realize, like, you know, how, I don't know, backwards we were on some of those issues as socialists and how far we had to go. I think that the most interesting reception has been its international reception. So one of the first places I was asked to share my work was on the eastern coast of South Africa, in Durban, South Africa, on the eastern coast, and a little bit in the center, but more on the eastern coast. And the comrades there sometimes joke amongst themselves about practicing Marxism with Zulu characteristics, because it's a heavy Zulu and Xhosa identity there. So I was immediately thrown into, amongst Marxists, talking about queer politics with a largely black, in a largely black non-Western context. And that really, it continues to be really inspiring to me. Last year when, like we could go places and stuff, I gave a talk beside a comrade from Zimbabwe on gender abolition and how the concepts of man and woman are entities, that are shaped by the capitalist mode of production. And I mean, that was just really exciting to me, to see how globally comrades were just grabbing quickly onto the issues that we were talking about. And there was this, this strange, interesting universalism and diversity that was actually playing out in person that was exciting to me. The other thing was that meeting with and learning about the organizing challenges of comrades around the world made me realize how specific gender production can be in a particular region, and how that specific manifestation of gender and queerness is tied to the historical reality, the historical material reality of that particular place. Let me see. I don't know. So one of the responses that I got was, I was giving a talk about how messy and useless I felt the term homonormativity was. And I think that comes across in the book. I do think that heteronormativity and cisnormativity makes sense, but the term homonormativity just kind of means like middle-class gay people to me, or rainbow capitalism. It's not a term that's symmetric to heteronormativity or cisnormativity. Like there's pressure to be straight and there's pressure to be cis, but how is there pressure to be gay? Like, what does that even mean? What it doesn't mean like middle class, it just usually means heteronormativity. So my thought was just like, all right, let's keep it simple and just say heteronormative then. And it was just one of those kind of linguistic things that irritated me because it was just constantly being thrown around and it didn't seem to mean anything. But so a comrade from Beirut challenged me on this, and he said, he was saying, what do you mean you don't know what homonormativity is? And so I gave him my point of view, and I joked and I said, so what, like capital or the state pressures you to like Madonna and show tunes? And he stayed like just kind of really stayed and like he just looked at me and he said, yeah, in Lebanon, like queer refugees that come in are expected to provide state officials evidence that they're really gay by doing things like showing them that they like show tunes and Madonna. And I said, wow, okay, that is homonormativity then. There we have it, So I learned all these just really interesting, by traveling around the world and talking to comrades around the world about Marx, about material social relations under capital, and about gender. I learned so much. And as far as responses go beyond that, I think that the responses that surprised me most were the personal responses. One woman told me that she read a particular passage from the book every night before falling asleep. And, I wasn't expecting people to respond in any way like that. I did not think that people would find personal meaning in the book to the extent that some people have. And that's really meant a lot to me, because I guess that means that, if I fucked up something in my political analysis, at least it inspired a comrade to go on for another day. So that's, it's good. So those were some of the reactions that I had. All right, next question. So if you could write an addendum 4 years after The Politics of Everybody was published, how would developments of the past 4 years, specifically the collapse of the ISO and Me Too feature, are there conclusions that I've reassessed or ideas that I only wish would have gotten a greater hearing? So as I said earlier, I think that a lot of the things that I was saying were very context dependent on the moment. And I hope that in the future generations look at them and they go, wow, what were they going through at that time period where they would even think such weird things? Hopefully there would be an advance in the thought. So, at the time when I was writing, the Marxist movement was really just stodgy, I guess you could say. Like, I found that the Marxist movement was largely embracing second wave feminism, particularly the revolutionary Marxist movement. And second wave feminism was being approached in this way. It was like almost like boomer feminism or something like that. It was really strange. So I think that if I was adding something, I would maybe go a little bit further in certain directions. I would use I would put a standalone chapter that could be used practically to fight TERFs and SWERFs. Because one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was for trans and intersex comrades. And I haven't noticed the book being used specifically to put those arguments to rest, which means to me that I wasn't clear enough. As far as the Me Too question goes, I think that it's a hard question. I would not add it as some kind of addendum, because it goes into this kind of interpersonal territory I was talking about that the Marxist movement has so far, as of yet, not been equipped for. And I think that the answers do come from incorporating the histories and the knowledges of Black feminisms and non-Western feminisms and queer feminisms. This is not to replace, a Marxist economic assessment, but to supplement how we interact with one another. The title of The Politics of Everybody is in part about not understanding totality as a monolith or a single universal set. and understanding the dialectical relationship between totality and the interpersonal. So instead of tacking on a Me Too comment onto the old book, one of the things that I'm working on is a new book that looks at some of these questions through a Marxist lens. And my next book is going to be no less Marxist, but it's going to be much more concerned with an economic, material, social analysis of the interpersonal more directly. And also, some good news here. You will find out how I'm going to handle some of these questions in an addendum, because the book is The Politics of Everybody is being re-released with a new preface. I have yet to write it, but that is in the final stages of being worked through with the publisher. So when I do write it and it is published, I will make sure to send a copy to everybody in this reading group, so that you will have the, I suppose you could say, updated version of the book, without having to go out and buy the new one. How am I doing on time? Look at there. Am I doing okay on time?
Yeah, you're at like 24 minutes.
Fantastic. Sounds good. Okay. So next question. Your book lays some special emphasis on class as the central factor in understanding the world, and in contrast to much queer nationalist politics central to how we organize to change it. In the past several years, since the rise of Sanders, we've seen a growth in proudly class reductionist social politics, such as the right wing of the DSA, Adolf Reed, Chibber, a thinker you cite positively in the third chapter. What do you see as the limits in a Marxist to politics that downplays oppression, by analogy to your analysis of queer nationalism, a class nationalist politics? Well, class nationalist politics is terrifying to me. A funny story talking about how local the idea of queer nationalism is, before I get into the Chibber question, is when I was in Croatia, I was talking about the queer community. So I was giving a talk in Croatia, and I was talking about the queer community and the problems with the conception of the queer community and queer nationalism. And people had the hardest time fathoming what I was talking about. Like, they were just, so people were asking questions like, do you mean, is there a movement to like have all the queer people living together in a community, like in a large building together? And I said, no, not at all, And then when I tried to describe it more, they'd say like, so you mean like, the work of political organizers that are agitating for, for queer rights in the streets? And I was like, well, no, it's not that either, right? Not everybody's political, that would identify, as part of this community. So I realized, like, with the difficulty of explaining what that is, how specific some of these questions are to histories of locations, to, the histories of capital in particular locations. So the Chibber, yeah, it's definitely the most yikes part of the book for me. And it's not because my position has changed at all, as much as it is my interpretation of what I thought Chibber was trying to say is no longer plausible, right? So I was looking for a framework for thinking through internationalism and the problem of universality. And when I read Chibber's work, arguing for kind of a return to material assessment and to a return to universalism, I thought that I could insert a more complex, more open-ended concept of universality in there. And I mean, I'm not a Maoist or anything like that, but I was and have been, on a philosophical level, influenced by Elaine Badiou's work, particularly when he talks about this concept where he just says that, post-structuralism kind of got off on talking about everybody's differences, and where differences is what needs to be celebrated. And, his position is that, like, difference is basically all there is, right? Alterity is all there is, he says. And human existence is incredibly complex. But what's interesting isn't so much difference as it is when we make these unifying connections at particular moments. And in those moments, we have this bond of commonality. So that's more what I was trying to reach for, So I bring up the Chibber, and then he turns out to be, an important theorist for the right wing of social democracy, and I'm an internationalist and a revolutionary. So I definitely would, if I was rewriting the book, I would have probably leaned more on Ijaz Ahmad's work to fully articulate some of my criticisms. And that was a bit of a downer for me. I don't look into the politics of every person. I don't, analyze the politics of every person that I'm reading. Maybe I should more. Lesson learned. Next question. So, since marriage equality was achieved in the U.S., you see this here. Since marriage equality was achieved in the U.S. and Trump took office, the overt homophobia of institutions in the US has been soft-pedaled in favor of transphobia. For instance, the guidelines from the Trump administration who want to exclude trans women from homeless shelters. Have we entered a new era in queer politics and their repression? And how do these developments fit in with the analysis in my book? So my answer to this is I don't think that we've entered any particular new phase. I think that acceptance and demonization of LGBT folks isn't linear because class society, even before capitalism, class society is predicated on familial ordering. And because of that, queer people are an easy target for anybody who's trying to rouse the public in their favor in times when, in uneasy times. In the downturns of capitalism. So, for the past decade, I've kind of been railing against the sort of progressive articulation that says that, well, as soon as all these old assholes die off, everything's going to be okay, and young progressives will take their place. And it never works like that. Because capitalism's unstable in tough times, the demagogues are just going to use us as a scapegoat. I gave a paper a while ago that I probably should have turned into something more public that was about how fascists read both queers and Jews as rootless cosmopolitans. There's this kind of doubling effect that happens where sometimes we substitute as a kind of Jewishness. We're kind of like, the rootless cosmopolitans undermining the foundations of the nation state. Yeah, I don't think that just as, anti-Semitism comes up again, right? I think that queer politics is going to, come up that way. And when I wrote the book, there was this idea, there was a sense in the world that gay and lesbian identities were co-optable, but trans identities were somehow immune from co-optation by capital. And another thing that I've long argued is that capitalists will profit off of anything. And then shortly after that, we had Wells Fargo dressing up their headquarters in the trans flag to make a particular political point. Capitalism isn't monolithic. There's different sectors that are constantly competing against one another. Sometimes they want the, progressive to take a progressive line. So I think that the question embedded in this is, what do we do with the intersection of turf politics and far-right politics, right? Like somebody like Trump saying we don't want trans women into our shelters. And I think that the answer to this is to understand that turf politics are far-right politics. There's no reason to, gatekeep genders for what? I mean, if we go back to the Internationale, right? What are the lines? No more traditions change shall bind us, right? So clearly we've always sensed that somehow relying on tradition is connected to exploitation. The question's always been to figure out how, or the earth shall rise on new foundations. So I don't think that we should stand for particular definitions of social groups. And, people who are trying to guarantee the authenticity of old foundations are probably not friendlies of the socialist movement, of the revolutionary movement anyway. And I think that the big difference between now and 2015 is that that's the settled question on the US left. Not in the UK left, but it's a settled question, I believe, in the Marxist left in the United States. So do I have time for 2 more questions to answer?
Yeah, you're at 32.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Great, 2 out of 7 left. So this question here. Is the Politics of Everybody Reads as a manifesto for queer Marxism, especially the last chapter? In the Marxist tradition, a manifesto is intimately connected with a program and a political organization which can bring that program into being. In the US and many other countries, there are only small and scattered groups that even recognize the need for the kind of organization your manifesto-like text presumes is a goal. What are the forces that will build a mass organization dedicated to queer revolutionary Marxism, and how can we build them? So yeah, I think that that is a great question. It started making me think about manifestos in general. And, you know, yeah, I think that even beyond Marxist manifestos, that manifestos do imply some kind of group allegiance, even if it's tactical and temporary. So yeah, there's definitely no group I'd identify as the leader of the world proletariat right now, or even the precursor to that sort of group. And if anything, going around the world and talking to people and meeting with other Marxists is only, you know, understanding more richer in my mind than it was before. So, but there are people around the world who are anti-capitalists and who are communists of some variety. And many of those people are turning to Marx for their understanding of what it means to be a capitalist and what it means to be a communist. And I'd like to think of my book as preparatory in some small way. So if there ever is a global force that could end capitalism, that global force would need the solidarity of the whole class, very broadly construed. And I think that it means that we need to have the capacity to build a force that's solid enough that it won't, you know, break apart in the air due to turbulence, you know, excuse the metaphor there. So I'm just kind of hoping that this book or anything else that I write is clarifying enough to help towards that project. Of course, I would like to see Marxists take up. I wish there was some kind of organizing force that could help us in this moment, and there isn't. But I do think that in the imperfect ways that it is being taken up, hopefully by the time that we have such a group, some of these questions won't even be questions anymore. They'll already be answered, and it'll be that much easier for us to organize. So, and lastly, there's this, you know, lovely question that I got that is, so it is, I really love your writing in and of itself. I love imagery, like in your analysis of the vector model of oppression, the healing white light versus the laser beams of oppression, and the way that it combines satire and this almost science fiction imagery with the political analysis. And then it goes on, it's more complimentary. So thank you. And it says that it's a wonderful contrast to the bland academic jargon that I identify as a neoliberal trend and an intellectual dead end. And then the question asked me if I could talk about my writing influences and where that comes from. So yeah, I mean, that's always like such a wonderful compliment, and it's a wonderful thing to hear. And it means a lot to me. I think that when you reach out to people who are writing, to Marxists who are writing, and talk to them about their work, and you're happy about it, it really keeps you going, and I don't know, it really keeps you, it gets you inspired to do more, because you feel like you're making connections with other people. It's this distance way of it, right? You're making this connection, and it's important for writers. So I just wanted to say that. I wanted to say a little funny story about the laser beam analogy. I was talking to a friend, a comrade, and he said to me, you know, like, oh, I like how you use that disco, like a discotheque as an analogy, like lasers bouncing off a mirrored ball, you know, it was like very queer. It never crossed my mind that I was doing that at all. So I just said, okay, well, you know, I'm invoking queer culture in my analogy in ways that I never had any idea I was doing. So when it comes to writing, I write the way I work out problems in my head. And the way that I solve problems is that I try to explain things to myself. And I often do that by analogy or by breaking apart a problem that's in a way that's digestible for me, taking off pieces, seeing how that piece relates to the whole. And I think that it does take, I don't know, I try to cultivate like a kind of an ethic of patience. I don't have a lot of patience with myself. So it's something that I need to do to, to keep going. And I think that a few of my writing influences, I did work with the novelist E.L. Doctorow, so I've spent a lot of time thinking about writing. I, of course, am influenced by Marxist style, and I'm actually a huge fan of the Surrealists. And what that does is it helps me break through jargon, right? If I'm thinking about something in a way that's jargony, it means to me that I've probably stopped thinking about it. So I just think it's a good exercise. And then I also have like really problematic faves too, like writers that have helped me that I don't agree with their politics, like Borges, for example. He helped me think about writing with more concision. And also there's, there's Nietzsche's points about using cliches. Cliched language is non-communication. And Althusser, for example, is another philosopher whose ideas I don't subscribe to at all. But his word overdetermined really does connect to some of the problems that we have in communicating with one another, like I've mentioned before, the term homonormativity, where it ends up being used everywhere and then ends up kind of meaning nothing. And what I try not to read is propaganda, usually because, I don't know. I guess, here's the thing. When you're reading propaganda, you don't know it's propaganda because it sounds new to you. So by the time you're looking at something and going, yeah, this is just really super propagandistic, you already know all the information and you're not really reading it anymore. So I'm always kind of, I guess, looking for new information. The other thing is that jargon, being in a jargon, it means that you're in an insulated in-group, in an isolated in-group. And it is the way that, the world is empirically organized through experts, where you have your language and you have your language and you have your language and you figure out little problems. And if we all figure out our little problems and never integrate them dialectically, then, then we'll be fine. And it's that kind of lack of integrated knowledge that neoliberalism in particular, as a form of capitalism, operates off of. So, when I talk, I try to understand, thinking from an internationalist perspective, that people might not know the meaning of the word that I just said. And practicing that and using that as a point of discipline, it means that I have to describe what I'm talking about. I just can't like parrot a talking point or a party line or something that I've internalized. I have to examine it and I have to really find 10 different ways to articulate the thing that I'm saying. And it helps me understand what I'm saying better. And it's a practice that I would really suggest for anybody that's trying to organize. I mean, it works. I think it works for me really well. So if you liked my writing and you thought that was helpful to you, that, that's kind of my process for that. So those are the questions that were given to me. I have other things that I can talk about, but I also know that it's really difficult to listen to somebody for this long. The brain, and socialism is to talk 45 minutes and ramble really quickly. I'm gonna give you some time and maybe we can come back to some questions. One of the things that I would want to talk about is kind of conceptions of structure in the book and system. Because one of the other things that the book is really dealing with are, along the lines of jargon, right, are multiple understandings of the word structure. And what is a Marxist understanding of the word structure? What's a Marxist understanding of the word system? Or really, I should rephrase that because there's lots of different Marxist understandings of things, but what is specifically different from a non-Marxist understanding of system and a Marxist understanding of system? And I think it's particularly important in street politics, because everybody's down with like smashing the system, and everybody's down with like fighting the structures, but like we never talk about what those things are. So talking about what that means specifically as Marxists is, I think, helpful.